Hello and welcome to Love from the Other Side. If you are on this video, perhaps you too are in need of hope. We bring you stories from around the world of people that have shared their near-death experiences. While you may not agree with everything that they share, we ask that all comments be kept respectful and kind. I do want to give a warning about today's video. This may be a trigger for some of you. It starts out with Rose's husband taking his own life and the deep grief that she experienced living with that reality. So with that being said, let's go ahead and get started with today's video. When Rose's husband committed suicide at their home, she fell into a pit so deep that medical professionals expressed doubts that she would ever fully recover. On top of that, just 2 years later, Rose was diagnosed with cancer. And during what was supposed to be a minor medical procedure, she ended up bleeding to death, and she had no heartbeat for 10 plus minutes. While in heaven, she was told that if she agreed to return to Earth, her body would be restored to good health, both physically, emotionally, and mentally. This is her story. I died on a Wednesday night. For most people, that would be the end of their story, but for me, it was a beginning. 2 years before my death, my husband had killed himself. He used a gun. We weren't estranged. We were in love, or so I thought. Our last conversation was a telephone call, and we argued. It was ugly. He hung up abruptly. It was the last time I'd ever hear his beautiful baritone voice. We had big plans for his upcoming retirement. Many people, including me, thought we were well suited for one another and a good match. After his death, I lost my mind. I had a mental breakdown. I couldn't see any way out of this hell. I pleaded with God every night to either let me die or heal me. My life had been happy, and now it was hellish. 2 years after my husband's suicide, I was diagnosed with cervical cancer and underwent a minor surgical procedure. After the procedure, I bled out and died. I was dead. No blood pressure and no pulse for more than 10 minutes. I was unconscious at the time of my passing, and I woke up when I died. One of my first thoughts in this new realm was that my prayers had been answered. I was so grateful that I had been granted a release from my hell on earth. In this new realm, I felt the presence of the angels and the Holy Ghost. I was enveloped in peace, light, and love. This experience went on for some time, and eventually I came to a door. The angels stopped me there. As a lifelong reader of near-death experiences, I knew what that door meant. It was my last opportunity to return to that old life, but I had no desire to go back, and I told my angelic companions this very thing. Even in death, I remembered the agony of my husband's suicide. The angels said that if I agreed to return, I would be healed of the grief and emotional pain and the grisly nightmares. It was made clear to me that I had been taken to heaven for healing, but for now, returning to earth might be the better choice. During my subsequent hospitalization, it was affirmed that I had bled to death, and the medical test showed that the cancer was gone. But the real healing was the restoration of my soul. Less than 30 days after my discharge from the hospital, I began selling off all of my worldly possessions, including my shiny new car and my beautiful home. 5 months after my near-death experience, I was in an affordable and practical used car heading due west. 1,000 miles later, I landed in the Midwest, ready to start a new life. I have experienced hell on earth, and I have experienced God in heaven. I can truthfully say that even though it was a cross that raised me, I'm grateful for these experiences. Dying was the best thing that ever happened to me, and it literally saved my life. Now, let's talk about heaven. At the moment of my death, I popped out of my body like toast out of a toaster. The best word I can use to describe my soul's departure is capulated. I was unconscious when I died, but I woke up when my heart stopped. It's been 3 years since this happened, and I still remember how it felt to awaken from that deep, dreamless, unconscious state into an instant awareness, perhaps better described as a knowing, that my time on earth had ended. This awakening wasn't frightening or startling. To the contrary, it was indescribably pleasant. It was akin to awakening from an intense dream, but far more enjoyable. In a split second, that I went from unconscious human to fully awakened spiritual being, I experienced the most profound mental acuity that I have ever known. It was as though a massive surge of spiritual power poured through every iota of my consciousness, and I went from 60 amps to 100,000 amps in an instant. At the moment of my death, I sensed an elastic strand of silver running from the crown of my head to the bottom of my heels, and it was as though someone pulled back on that strand like an archer's bow and let loose. With an audible pop, my soul left my body, and while it was dramatic and quick, it was also incredibly gentle and completely devoid of any unpleasantness or suffering. As this separation occurred, I heard a pop or a ping. One of my first thoughts was, I'm awake, but I'm no longer connected to my body. After the separation occurred, I began floating away from the body with the softness of a feather on a summer's breeze. The instant I felt that jolt and then experienced the feeling of floating, I knew what had happened. I have marveled at this inherent knowledge so many times, but I knew what had happened. I knew the whole of it. I was conscious and happy and free. And the first words out of my mouth in this new heavenly form, were, "My heart has stopped." This sudden death had been a surprise ending, but the truth of the matter is, it was a good surprise. 29 months earlier, my much-loved husband had ended his life. He died instantly. I wasn't so lucky. In that time between his permanent death and my temporary death, I lost my mind. I suffered the torments of the damned. By late summer of 2018, I was just starting to crawl out of the black pit of despair. I walked the dog and rode my bike and watched television and gazed at the tall trees in my backyard as they swayed in the breeze from the nearby wetlands. I did a lot of yard work in an effort to stay in shape and also to bring more beauty into my world. While moving a 60-pound bag of rock from one spot to another, I felt something happen internally, somewhere deep in my lady part. I went inside and saw that I was spotting. Soon thereafter, I visited the gynecologist and was diagnosed with cervical cancer. A subsequent visit to an oncologist confirmed the gynecologist's diagnosis and said that it was stage 2. The oncologist observed the disease had spread to a point where the flesh was distorted. A cervical biopsy was scheduled for September 5th to discover how far the cancer had spread. Most people don't die from cervical biopsies, but I'm not most people. After the biopsy, I was sent home from the hospital even though I was bleeding profusely. When I explained that I was losing a lot of blood, the medical personnel told me that I'd feel better once I was home. Less than an hour after arriving home, I realized that I was bleeding to death, and an ambulance was summoned. By 6 p.m. on September 5th, 2018, Rosemary Thornton, a 59-year-old widow, mother of 3, and author of 9 books, was dead. After hearing myself say, "My heart has stopped," I then said out loud, "How do I know that my heart has stopped?" I thought about this for a moment and then I said, "I don't know how I know that, but I know that it's right." In my 6 decades upon earth, I've never known anything so perfectly as I knew that simple fact. It was as if I'd say the sky is blue and the grass is green. There was no emotion attached to this observation. There's a belief that when death is sudden, tragic, and unexpected, the soul gets confused as to what has occurred and can even get stuck on earth wandering around trying to sort out the mystery. In my own transition, there was no mistaking what was happening. As I took in these new surroundings, I was talking and I could hear myself, and it was comforting to observe that not only could I hear my voice, but it sounded just like it always had sounded. After a verbal declaration that my heart had stopped, my next comment was, "Well, actually, you're not dying, you're dead." That struck me as quite funny. Here I am, going on to my reward, and my predominant thought is actually correcting my tense. I laughed out loud. I heard myself laugh. I heard my spirited, goofy, unique Rosemary giggle. And then I thought, I don't have any breath sounds, I don't have any lungs or vocal cords. How am I producing sound? How am I hearing sound? As a former reporter, lifelong researcher, and devoted historian, I've always thought of myself as something of a smart cookie with a keen and intense curiosity about the world around me. But this was a lot to take in. I was trying to figure out what this new life would be like, but I was also thoroughly enjoying the ride. It seemed like I was thinking a dozen thoughts at once, so specifically defining the timeline or sequence of events is very difficult. With childlike wonder, I rejoiced in the realization that every single thing I was and am had made this transition. I was still me, right down to my quirky humor, deep voice, and funny little giggle. It's part of the human experience to wonder what life is like when the body dies, and being an anxiety-prone, overthinking every single thing writer, I had ruminated on this topic more than most. This realization that nothing about me had changed was immensely comforting. Even at this early point in the experience, one of the thoughts that flittered through my mind was, what exactly did I leave behind on that gurney? I was still floating away from my body, but I couldn't see my body. In fact, I was floating in something that I would describe as perfect blackness. It was black, but it wasn't. It was the silkiest, softest, and most comfortable and comforting atmosphere I have ever experienced. I heard someone describe it as black velvet, and that's a good description. I remember thinking, I don't like the dark, but I'm not the least bit frightened. In fact, I feel great. With that, I have since learned that it's become clear that not seeing my body was God's mercy. My death was messy. A friend, Effie, who had accompanied me to the hospital, explained that the medical personnel emerged from my room 4 times, carrying armloads of linen soaked in blood. Even after I was resuscitated and prepared for transport to another hospital, Effie observed that I was literally white as a sheet and that my lips were deep blue. Truthfully, I'm glad I didn't see that either, and from what I've learned, it was electricity that restarted my heart. I wouldn't want to bear witness to any of that part of the process. It's as though my tender-hearted Heavenly Father had shielded me from this gruesome scene, just as a loving parent would put their hands over their child's eyes and say, "Dearie, you don't need to see what's happening right now. Let's close your eyes." The blackness in which I was floating was neither hot nor cold, neither damp nor dry. I sensed that I could feel those things, but in this environment was utterly perfect and again, both comfortable and comforting. I remember thinking, this is so wonderful. How could this get any better? It seems like a silly question now, but this thing of floating was that glorious and comforting. And yet I knew I was just stepping into the front foyer. I couldn't wait to see what was coming next. I also thought, my entire life I've been frightened of dying, and I've wondered how I would die, and now it's happening, and it is great. I was experiencing the most perfect peace imaginable. And even then I thought, this is really cool. I wish I had known the end would be like this. I wish I could have known that my death would actually be so peaceful and easy. I wouldn't have been worried all of these years. Floating further and further away from my body, I felt no attachment to my former life, and not one smidge of sadness about what I was leaving behind, because I knew in that moment I was truly not leaving anything behind. I was just moving from one place to another, just slipping from here to there. This may seem hard to understand, but in that place, there's not a thought of loss or sorrow or sadness, not a single thought. Even now, I do wonder how it is I didn't worry about my 3 grown children, or my little Sheltie, or my friends, or maybe my shiny new car, or my beautiful house, or my little red golf cart, but none of that mattered in the slightest. In the midst of the experience, I felt no attachments of any kind whatsoever, and I also felt the most perfect peace I had ever known. It was almost as though I ceased playing the part when my heart stopped. The word personality comes from a Latin word meaning mask, and when the mask was gone, so were all the typical attachments. In this new place, I wasn't mother, friend, or author. All of those personas had been earthly attachments, and now I was leaving Earth and returning to my Creator. And at this point, I was just me, a child of the Most High God returning home. And as the old Christian song says, I was just going home. It was as though my essence represented 1/100000th of one drop of water in the ocean, and I was reunited with the ocean, and it was an ocean of comfort and peace. I'd always felt like such an oddball in this world, but now finally I was in a place where I was well known and well loved and well regarded. As I floated away from my body, the people and the places of my earthly life were nowhere on my mental, emotional horizon. I didn't think about Effie patiently waiting in the hallway of the emergency room. I didn't think about Effie's sister Millie on her knees at my home, praying that God would spare my life. I didn't think about what a surprise this would be to anyone who knew me. I didn't think about my memorial service or the fact that my lifeless body was now laid out on a gurney looking pretty rough. Prior to being dead, I was a relatively healthy female who'd gone into the hospital several hours earlier for a very simple 30-minute procedure. I hadn't told anyone other than Effie and Millie about this medical procedure. My children had no idea. None of this crossed my mind as I floated within this comforting blackness. This is just the tip of the iceberg of what Rose has to share about her near-death experience. If you would like to read her full story, she has a book available on Amazon. I will put a link to that book in the About section of this video. Thank you again for joining us, and until next time, God bless.